Good afternoon and welcome everyone to part two of our series, Tariffs Are Shifting. Are you ready? My name is Tom Gould and I'm the Chief Strategy and Compliance Officer at Gaia Dynamics, a new company that using artificial intelligence to determine HTS classification, tariffs, and related regulatory requirements. At Gaia Dynamics, I help shape the strategic vision of the company, ensuring our platform delivers innovative, efficient, and compliant tools to help tackle global trade challenges. For more than 30 years, I've worked in international trade, customs compliance, and global supply chain management. Tariffs are indeed shifting. Over the last couple of weeks, the trade community has seen more changes than in the last year. Just last week, during part one of our discussion, the new administration announced reciprocal tariffs. Are you ready? Well, honestly, I don't think any of us are. That's why programs like this are so important, bringing the trade community together to talk through and understand where we're at, how we got here, and how best to prepare our leadership and our companies for what may happen next. So let's get started today. I'm pleased to be joined by two experts. First, Cindy De Leon. Cindy is the founder of De Leon Trade, LLC, and has over 29 years of experience in the international trade industry. She previously served as Senior Auditor and Assistant Field Director with U.S. Customs and Border Protection's Regulatory Audit Division in Chicago, where she worked closely with importers to enhance internal control programs and ensure customs compliance. Welcome, Cindy.
Thank you.
Cindy and I are joined by Heidi Woods, a licensed customs broker with over 10 years of experience in the trade and compliance field, and over 8 years in the medical device industry. She's currently the leader of the trade for Medtronics, the world's largest medical device company, where she serves as the Global Trade Operations Senior Director. Heidi was recently a co-chair for 3 years on AEI's Healthcare Industries Committee and has been actively involved in the HIC for the past 8 years. Thank you for joining us, Heidi.
Thanks for the opportunity, Tom.
Thank you. For more information about our panelists and sponsor, please click on the resources button at the bottom of your screen and use the Q&A button to submit questions at any point during our program. We will address as many as time allows and we are planning on actually addressing the questions during the presentation, so please feel free to post those. We will see about addressing those throughout the program. Let's see. So let's begin by addressing what's happened over the course of the last week, essentially where we find ourselves now. Some key points that we're going to cover include the recently announced reciprocal tariffs and the steel and aluminum tariffs, including tariffs on steel and aluminum derivative products. Angela and Cindy, I'd like to begin by asking each of you what resources you use to keep up with all of the new and existing tariffs.
You want to start, Cindy?
No, you go ahead.
Perfect. Okay. So, yeah, resources that we use. So I would say a lot of them. And first of all, again, thanks for the opportunity. I think this is almost like a therapy session for us all to get together and talk about how difficult right now is and what we're navigating through. So hopefully you find a lot of value in the conversation. So I would say, we've been definitely starting with ACE data as a starting point to use as a platform of analysis. But then we have also really been leaning in on our brokers in terms of getting item-specific information. So where we've got part numbers that can be analyzed, and we can really understand what is driving these additional duty rates. I can honestly say we have been struggling within my company to get resourcing for data and analytics support for a very long time. And it is mind-blowing how many people want to help right now in terms of getting awareness out on what if, right? So not only what is, but all these what ifs and these what if scenarios. So we've gotten additional support from our data and analytics team to be able to create some dashboards where we can do really quick and dirty analysis to get tops down what is happening with different scenarios. So going through these different scenarios of what ifs with Mexico, what ifs with Canada, what ifs with China. And then as things have been coming to light, utilizing those dashboards to be able to drill down which businesses within Medtronic are imported or are impacted by this. So is it our cardiovascular space? Is it our diabetes, or what have you, so that we can communicate to different OU leaders or operational unit leaders on what their financial impact is. But I would say one of the challenges that we've had is the way that we get our data from our brokers is different. And so synthesizing that data and cleansing it to be consistent across the board has been somewhat of a challenge. But again, with this data and analytics resourcing support, we've been able to navigate through that. And the team's working quite well through that now. So Cindy, what are your thoughts? Anything additional that you wanted to add?
Yeah, no, and I think that's a great, I always love it when importers plug ACE and have ACE data, because your executives are always going to ask you, how much is this going to cost me? And if you don't have your ACE data, you're not going to know how much it's going to cost you at the US border. I think beyond that, I mean, I guess from an information, if we take one step back, we're looking at Federal Register notices, we're looking at CSMS messages, we're looking at whitehouse.gov to kind of stay on top. We're watching the news, we're watching LinkedIn. So a lot of people are asking, how are you staying on top of it? Well, there's a number of sources. I'm connected to, a half a dozen very prominent law firms. And so I definitely look at their postings because they're on top of it as well. When I think of that, that's like the front end. Then how does this impact you as an importer? ACE data critical. Then I also look at data from a wider perspective, right? And that is, and I'm not here to plug any software, but there's software out there where you can get information like what other companies export to the United States within that same tariff heading that you're buying from, because you might need to procure from a different country. You might need to procure from a different supplier, and so a way to do that, to be able to be a little bit more nimble with respect to procurement and with respect to, let's say, UFLPA enforcement, is having data that talks about global import and export.
Thank you. There's a question that popped in the Q&A that I'd like to just address quickly. And the question is, could you please share the links of different sources you use to stay on top of changes coming in? If you take a look at the bottom of the screen and you click on the resources tab, the resources button, there's a couple of tabs. I think one of them is resource with links. Another one is documents. We've given you a few there. But as we have others, we can also include those or ask AI to share those as well. Wonderful. Thank you. Um, let's see. One of the questions that we have been looking at is that when you look at the tariffs, there's mention of exceptions for products that are classified in Chapter 98. Um, and there are some situations where you can avoid paying the new tariffs on part of the value or potentially on the entire value if the product is classified in Chapter 98. Um, Heidi, do you want to talk to us a little bit about how you might use Chapter 98 provisions to avoid or
Yeah.
mitigate the tariffs?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's a lot in Chapter 98, and it's kind of all over the place, in my honest opinion, but there are many different provisions that you can look at. And I think it depends on your industry and business, right? So I'm in the healthcare industry. We utilize something called Nairobi Protocol, which is for products that essentially alleviate an ailment, a chronic ailment, but do not cure it. So think like a pacemaker or a diabetes pump, right? You still have diabetes and you still have a bad heart, but this still assists. There is extra burden, I guess, that you would have to go through to make that claim or that analysis, right? You have to have backup information to substantiate that claim that it meets the protocol of Nairobi. But that is something that has really helped us in our analysis. I think thinking through for the different businesses that may be out there right now on this call, there are things like US goods returned that you can look at. There are requirements that you really need to make sure that you understand in order to start leveraging that tariff. So if you are If you are looking into those, I would just caution and make sure that you really read the full description, because you're going to have to do something additional. And I think the workload and the manpower kind of varies based on which one you're looking at. But don't just start slapping Chapter 98 all over these things, please, people. We don't want to do that. We need to make sure that what we're doing is substantiated by something. So I think there's a cost benefit analysis that you're going to have to do, and just understand that administrative burden may increase, but now the juice is really worth the squeeze when you think about how much we're spending in terms of additional duties, right? So just something that I wanted to throw out for people to think through.
Thank you, Heidi. And I think it's really important what you say about the juice being worth the squeeze and the additional requirements. Also, remember that some of these provisions apply to products that might have been unconditionally duty-free in the past. And so it may be that there's something out there that you could use that you never wanted to use in the past because of the additional requirements, and there was no reason to do it, but today there might be.
Great point.
Another question that came up, how are you tackling the item component level steel aluminum tariff reporting requirements? I'll throw that to either of
Oh
you.
gosh, what a great question.
It is.
So I would say we are still working through this. So I think, first first pass for us has been, what's the financial impact? And how do we make sure that people within our company understand what the financial what we've got to cover in terms of a deficit that's going to be coming our way, essentially from a profitability standpoint. As far as reporting requirements, I don't have a very well packaged answer for you at this point in time. We've been diving into this actively within my team to try to understand what it is that we need to vet. There's going to be an administrative burden on this for sure. And I think let's leverage each other with ideas on best practices to try to alleviate this as best we can. So I would say reach out to others that are in your same industry that are probably struggling with this as well. We are very minimally impacted by this, which is why I probably don't have a great answer for you. But I would say, again, leverage your networks and understand what are others doing. Pick up the phone. That's the blessing of AAEI, making sure that we are understanding who's in our like industries so that we can phone a friend when we are in not in trouble, but when we need some help and need a sounding board, right? To talk through these things. And I'm going to go out on a limb here. Tom, I saw the second question pop in.
Go
Did
for
you
it.
want to? Okay, so to be honest, I don't know exactly what is required here. I just know that within the HS codes, I think you have to understand if something is truly of where has the steel been poured, or and I'm not saying the right vernacular for those of you in the steel industry, I'm sorry. But if something was done in the United States, potentially you can, essentially, I think, no longer fulfill this requirement, or just because you've
Wait,
substantiated that it is US. Take it away, Tom. Please help me.
I was going to say, yeah,
I'm phoning a friend.
you could potentially avoid paying the additional tariffs on those steel and aluminum products if the raw material, if the raw steel was poured, and I think if the aluminum was cast in the United States. But there's another aspect of this as well, and that is the derivative products, where the value, I'm sorry, the additional tariffs only apply to the value of the aluminum or the value of the steel within the product. So that's something else that people need to be thinking about, is where are you going to get that information, and how are you going to communicate it to your broker, and how is your broker going to communicate it to CBP? I don't know. Cindy, do you have any other thoughts on that?
Bills of material.
Yes,
Mhm.
bills of material. You're
And
right.
that's where you're
Yeah.
getting the value. Yeah, and I think that, a lot of importers don't realize that things are getting that granular, and the need for that additional level of data and visibility is basically going to be required now. And there really needs to be a good working relationship between importers and their suppliers, especially when they're not related parties, to be able to ensure to get the level of detail needed to minimize the tariff outlay at the border, but also make sure that the information that you're providing to customs is correct and defensible if the audit comes.
Yeah, and I guess I would, thanks for triggering something else for me. With this, with companies that have many different operating units, what we're seeing is it is difficult to make sure that we've got standardization of bond formats, right? And having this be easily pullable. So I think Cindy's spot on with we need to make sure that we're advocating for what this requirement actually entails and helping executives understand what that workload may actually be to be able to get there and pull all this data to be able to go off of truly just the value of the element that's in question here in
Eh,
that particular scenario.
Cindy,
Tom,
you mentioned bombs, and there's a question or a
yeah,
comment saying you don't receive bombs from your unrelated vendors.
sure.
What do you do in those situations?
Sure. So remember, guys, my background is former customs auditor. I've been in this situation many, many times. I agree that an unrelated vendor doesn't want to readily hand over their bill of material, but many times an unrelated vendor does, I would tell you with firsthand experience, does hand over at least a part of a bill of material with certain information redacted to provide only the information that you absolutely need in order to meet your compliance requirements. I've seen this happen in free trade agreement reviews where you need a bill of material to make sure tariff shifts were met or regional value contents were met. I've seen that happen in the UFLPA context where we're trying to trace and map all the way back to raw materials where that supplier does cooperate to give you the information that you need. And so I think they're very sensitive to costing or who their suppliers are, especially for materials that don't, for materials that you don't need to know about. So I think at least you can expect to get a redacted from your unrelated supplier.
Wonderful. We've got a bunch more questions, but well, let me see. One of the questions I think is probably worth addressing. Do I have to review all my products that I'm importing that could have a steel screw or et cetera in it? I think the answer to that question is really what you need to look at is the HTS classifications that are listed in the executive order to see, because really it's a matter of, are the products that are being imported by their classification subject to the additional tariffs, right? You're not
Right.
importing the screw, you're importing the machine that happens to have a screw in it. So I don't believe that the tariffs are going to apply to that screw unless the product was one of the products that was listed as having to be
Right.
subject to the derivative tariffs.
That was my interpretation too, Tom. That we've gotten a list of HS codes from our brokers as well as service providers have provided this to us to understand what are the codes that are in scope of this. And then from there, we started doing a ton of analysis. So my understanding is it would only be those HSs in scope. Now, may that change? I don't know. Would we learn something additional? I'm not sure because this is so volatile.
It sure is. Let's move on to talking a little bit about valuation and valuation strategies. Because
Yay.
valuation is, yeah, thank you, Cindy.
Cindy.
Valuation has become so much more important these days. Cindy, I'd love to hear.
Yeah, no, gosh, if I had $1 for every value question I'm getting from clients, can I do this? Can I do that? Can I do this? Can I do that? I'm like, okay. I think the first thing, if you want to make a change to your value, I would ask you this question. Do you know what basis of appraisement you're in? If you don't know what basis of appraisement you're even in, you have no business adjusting your value at all. That's the first thing you need to do is remember, valuation is a hierarchy. You have transaction value of identical or similar, computed value, deducted value, and fallback. I think first, if you're going to make any changes, understand what basis of appraisement you're in, and then determine, is there any reason to preclude your use of transaction value? If there isn't, you're stuck there. Okay. If you're in a related party transaction and you haven't done a circumstances of sale test to be able to measure how acceptable the profit is and whether or not that profit is arm's length, you need to start there. Everyone's talking about, oh, for sale, buying agency agreements. Can we lower our computed value by taking these elements out of our computed value? All those things are great. But you first have to make sure that you're on solid footing. Let's say you are on solid footing with computed value, as an example. I know of clients that when we came in to do a review, they were claiming too much in freight. They were claiming too much in warehousing costs, because for freight, you're only supposed to capture the freight on raw materials. So southbound movements of freight of raw materials into the production facility, not freight on finished goods coming back up north to the United States from Mexico. A lot of companies have one general ledger account that has freight, and it's all commingled there. So then you need to work with your accounting team to make sure that they make separate accounts to be able to capture northbound, southbound freight. Warehousing costs, if you have warehousing costs that are in the United States that are storing finished goods, well, that's not a cost to produce the good itself. Now, there are rules around all that. You got to be careful. If those warehousing costs are being incurred by the Mexican facility, you're probably going to have to include them. So there's just a lot of rules there. I would say make sure you're well aware of what the law requires. Make sure that you look at rulings before you make quick changes to your valuation methodology and strategy.
Great advice.
So here's a question touching on the value. Cindy, is it correct that you can only claim for sale going forward, not retroactively?
I mean, if you're in reconciliation, maybe you can claim it retroactively.
I'll jump on that one then. There's nothing that prohibits companies from claiming it retroactively, but you're asking for review and scrutiny by customs. When I've worked with companies in the past and been asked this question, I've always said to them, it's not worth it. We talked about, is the juice worth the squeeze? By doing that, you are going to have to basically show customs that you had your processes and procedures in place in the past, and that they were rock solid, and they were doing things, and you were doing everything right. So generally, when companies look to do first sale, they start by sitting down and making sure that their processes and procedures are done right and are compliant. And that's why generally companies don't recommend doing retroactive first sale claims.
Yeah.
Um, Let's see. Another question maybe the question came in, can you provide a list of HTS codes where this would apply? And I think that question was about the derivative products. The codes are in the annexes to the proclamations. I'm sure we can get those if you haven't seen them already. But one of the things that's important to understand with those is that there is a provision in the proclamation to allow for additional codes to be included. So it's important to get the list, but it's also important to keep it current. We talked a little bit about valuation strategies. Um, Cindy, can you talk to us a little bit maybe about classification and country of origin strategies that companies might consider today in today's environment?
That's a slippery slope, Tom, because I think some of these Federal Register notices even kind of call out, and advise the importing community that you better be careful about any tariff engineering or country of origin engineering that you're doing, because the government may still pursue these IEPA duties against the importer. So I think that you really need to be careful of what you're doing. And I think a lot of people have heard about tariff classification engineering and making sure that where you decide to end one production process and then move the remainder of a production process that imparts a substantial transformation to another country that is more favorable from a tariff perspective. Like, let's say you have a lot of production going on in China, but then you move that semi-finished good from China, let's say, to Malaysia, that doesn't have a Section 301 or maybe doesn't have the IEPA duties, and then you finish the manufacturing there. But that manufacturing process that happens in another country has to impart a substantial transformation in order for the good to be a product of Malaysia. So just looking at different places and not completing an article all in one place might be something good for you from a country of origin engineering perspective.
Right. I guess I would just add on to that I think we have to keep on talking about the workload associated with each of these. I feel like a broken record, right? But every one of these mitigating strategies is going to require some effort. And so just understanding like what Cindy said, you have to do the analysis, and the details of this really matter. So making sure that you understand this and that your process of country of origin assignment and engineering is kind of in control. Sometimes with large companies, while the trade actions are all controlled by trade, people get great ideas in the company, and I'll say great in air quotes, right? Like I can't tell you how many non-supply chain people have said, oh, you know what, if we just ship this from, the Netherlands, now we can avoid all of this. And it's like, no, that's not how this works. None of this works that way. With country of origin being a real thing that needs to be still honored. So I think, herding the cats within companies is something that I've been spending a lot of time doing, I guess, lately, to try to make sure that people understand the messaging. And my team has been doing that as well.
So when we were planning for this conversation, one of the things that I raised that was asked to kind of share with people is a couple of limitations and a couple of recommendations that companies need to be aware of. When you have your broker file an entry with customs, the customs broker uses their software to calculate the duty. And in today's environment, when there's two, three, four, five, even six classifications on an entry, for example, there's the normal classification with the normal duty, the Section 301 duty, the new 10% duty, potentially anti-dumping, countervailing. I was on a call with a client recently where they are dealing with a product that's subject to normal duty, the China Section 301, the new 10% duty, anti-dumping, countervailing, and Section 232 duty, all at the same time. There's a limit in the ACE system where the ACE system cannot calculate the duty amount, the total duty amount, if there are more than two HTS numbers on an entry summary line. So if you have the normal duty, the Section 301 duty, and the new 10% duty, the customs broker software should be able to do those calculations, but what happens is the broker software transmits that to customs, and if there's two or fewer HTS numbers, customs will send a message back to the broker saying if the calculation was wrong. If the calculation was wrong and there's three or more numbers, the broker won't get that message. So because of that, it's really critical today, more so than ever, to do pre-entry audits as well as post-entry audits. And if you're doing those types of audits, now is the time to modify those audits to double check to make sure that the math is done properly, because you don't want to get caught in a situation where after the fact, the duty calculation was found out to be wrong. You tried to do everything right. You provided all the right information to the broker entered the information right in their system. The system didn't do the calculation right and customs didn't catch it until an audit after the fact. You don't want to get caught in that type of a situation. An answer to one of the questions about the list of the HTS numbers, I see Michael put them in the chat. So there's a Q&A at the bottom. There's also a chat at the bottom. If you click on the chat, you can see there's a link to the aluminum tariff with a list of derivatives and the steel tariff executive order with a list of derivatives. Let's see. So Heidi, this is a question for you. The normal duty rates and the Section 301 duty rates are eligible for duty drawback, but the IEEPA duty rates, the new 10% duty, is not. Can you talk a little bit about maybe your drawback program and how you address all these different tariffs?
Yeah, I know. Um, and it's getting complicated, right? So I think what we've started to do is bucket out what the additional tariffs are and what are the potential mitigation strategies for that bucket of increased tariffs. So where duty drawback is not eligible, obviously you can't go after that. And so then it's like you're pivoting and thinking about what is a different strategy that I could go forward with and explore. So free trade zones is something that we're looking at to better understand. And I think, what I mean by that is we import products quite a bit into US distribution centers but then it will leave US distribution centers for consumption in a different location outside of the US. And so for those products, we're exploring right now what's the possibility there for us to capture in terms of savings. What I will say is I'm still trying to research what does that mean from an FDA perspective, because I do know that there's something tricky with FTZs and FDA. So candidly, I'm not that far, but we're still working on that to try to get that identified. So I think, you know, I'm kind of thinking of it as a decision tree for each of these different buckets of additional tariffs and what you can do in terms of mitigation strategies for each of those additional tariffs is going to vary. And we need to be organized. And so I think a spreadsheet is my best friend right now. That along with Jen West from my team, who is helping me through this entire thing. So, but we're really needing to remain organized with this so that we can communicate this to higher level leaders who will then understand what are our options. Because again, some of these higher level executives are like, well, just change the value or just, you know, put it, duty drawback is something I heard of. Can't we do that for everything? You know what I mean? And so it's just, and they don't know, and we're helping them, but we're getting there. So I think FTZs is something we're looking at. We're also looking at, you know, is Nairobi Protocol cleansing our HS data, right? Is there any opportunity with that? But again, I know Cindy's like tensing up as I say that, probably because you absolutely have to make sure that what you're doing is right, right? So like if, and what I'm talking about here is maybe we've got some product families and maybe within that product family, something was in the wrong HS code. So we need to change that anyway. We've had very, very little impact from a duty perspective prior to all of this going through. So there's some cleansing of the data, and this is going to look different for every business. I think it depends on what your portfolio of products it looks like.
Cindy, I hope you don't mind. I'm going to put you on the spot with a couple of the questions that I see um, regarding valuation and reconciliation. The question that came in, and I don't know that I necessarily am asking for an answer, but maybe just to address the question itself, and the question is, what items can you legitimately exclude from transfer prices to help you moderate transaction value? I'd love to hear your thoughts about the concepts of transfer pricing, transaction value, reconciliation, and how these all come together and how they apply is how they impact your customs compliance.
The easy answer to the question is not much.
Yeah.
The I think some of the more obvious things are like international freight insurance. Those are things that you can deduct in certain circumstances if they're included in the price, if they're separately identified on the invoice, if you have the right support, as previously mentioned, you have to have all these things. Heidi, that was a great call out on that. So there are post-importation charges. If you have post-importation charges, duties, taxes, and fees in certain circumstances. So the easy things, non-dutiable charges can be deducted. Outside of that, I think most often when we look at transfer prices, we find that things are missing. So be careful about inviting in the government to come and look at your value because you want to bring it down when really where you started from wasn't even where you needed it to be. So I would.
Great call out
And I,
and super scary, Cindy. Thanks for terrifying all of us.
Yeah, and I don't mean to do that. It's just so often, one quick story, Tom, that I'll tell, and a lot of companies are in reconciliation. So if you are going to start exploring your value, I would be in the customs reconciliation program and hire an expert. And that way, if you find that that exploration path was really not a compliant one, you can change your values back to where they should be. But one quick question is when 301 came on, one quick comment was when 301 came online, a lot of companies were filing PSCs and protests to change their tariff classification and claim exclusions and get refunds. And they were just like the most popular people in school, right, at their company because they were getting these big refund checks. And a lot of them got audits as a result because either that classification really wasn't vetted or customs said, okay, great. You changed all these classifications over here. What about all these classifications over here that were not on the 301 list. Are those right? Should they have been on the 301 list? And found that a lot of them should have been. So a lot of companies went in and said, we're going to move tariff classifications out of the 301 list, but didn't look to move the ones that should have been in the 301 list. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's just be careful what you do, because customs does monitor changes. They have their systems, they have their targeting systems. I don't know if a lot of people are aware, but CBP is hiring, and they are hiring international trade targeting specialists. Go on usajobs.gov and you'll see it. And some of my former cohorts in regulatory audit at customs are taking these trade enforcement targeting positions, because like me, you give an auditor data, you're just giving them candy. They love to find anomalies and nuances. It's a very satisfying thing for an auditor.
Heidi, one of the things we've been talking, or we were talking about a bit, I'd love to hear your thoughts on our tariff classification engineering and country of origin engineering. What are
Mm,
some of the things that companies can be doing or should be thinking about doing to maybe change their product to
yep.
take advantage of some of the rules to get a lower duty rate?
Yeah, great question. Okay, so I can tell you this will wildly vary based on your product, right? So the opportunities here, I'm coming from, I used to be at Target Corporation prior to going to Medtronic. When I was at Target, uh, tariff engineering was so fun. So I was in the apparel and footwear area and loved it. Was working with product engineers to try to change garments prior to them actually coming into the US, prior to, stage gates and design reviews that would allow for changes to occur, where, putting the pockets below your waist would bring you to, this is old tapes, so forgive me, this might be slightly wrong, like 10.8 versus a 14.9 if it was considered to be, a different category. So I think through what your product portfolio is and what tolerance the internal company may have to making changes, because I do think that that answer varies and matters a lot too. It the structure of your company and how difficult or easy it is to navigate in terms of product design, how many different business units you're working with, what that looks like is going to dictate whether or not you can navigate through that. So I guess I would just say think through what that looks like for your portfolio. We're talking about, even in, we're again still candidly looking through all of our analysis and our data of what the products actually are that are triggering these additional tariffs. But once we get a bit farther, then we can bring that information to those business unit leaders to talk about what are potential options to mitigate that. The other thing that you asked about was country of origin, and I think, utilizing BOMs and understanding what that supply chain actually looks like is super important. So I would say 80-20 is a rule I absolutely live by all the time in terms of trying to first approach things. So what are your highest volume items that are causing the biggest heartburn in this increase or potential increase, and looking at what could we do from a different country perspective for sourcing, or even manufacturing. Maybe it is that you change it so that only a portion of the line is in a certain space, and then you change, a different part of the processing to a different location. Now, I say these things, and don't be alarmed, I'm in medical devices. That is not easy to do. So it's going to have a long runway, because it's highly regulated, to be able to make any of these changes. So, we're having conversations internally about, is this a 3-year thing or a 5-year thing to be able to change some of these suppliers or countries of manufacturing. So, I think everybody's business is going to look a little bit differently, but you have to think about those different aspects before just, diving into, I'm a country of origin engineer or tariff engineer. So, we always have to think about what's the art of the possible with constraints.
I've gotten a lot of questions about origin engineering and tariff engineering, especially recently. And one of the first pieces of advice that I give back to clients that ask me about these is, and because remember, I tend to deal with people that are dealing with the customs broker, people that are dealing with the products after they've been created and at the time that they're moving internationally. And so the initial conversation that I have with companies when they talk about this is, you're going to have conversations with people in the company that you may not know, that you may have never dealt with in the past, because you
100%.
can't really do tariff engineering or origin engineering after the goods have been produced, right? These are things that talk about changing characteristics of the product so that you can take advantage of a tariff, a change in tariff or a change in country of origin.
Totally. And it
Wonderful.
takes time,
It
and
does.
it's not quick. If you have quick wins, they're probably wrong. Probably.
Yes.
So
Here's another question that I'll ask to either of you is, will the Section 232 duties be applied when using a Chapter 98 tariff as well? For example, 9808 for military duty free.
ooh, I don't think so. I don't
I,
think they do.
I agree with you.
Because
It's
it's not dissimilar to Nairobi, which is 90.
exactly, yes.
So yeah, yeah. Um, but I don't know. Yeah, and actually I was just like, wait, we don't have any Nairobi protocol for anything that's triggering for 232. Okay,
I
So
was
sorry.
at, I was actually looking that up, and there is a Q&A section on CBP's website that addresses this question, and it links to a CSMS message. So I'm going to throw the link to the CSMS. I'm going to read it for a second. I was trying to actually research that, but
Thanks, Cindy.
yeah, I think you really need to look that up. And I would encourage you to look at CBP's website. A lot of these intricate questions are in the Q&A section, and a lot of times CBP does give the support, whether linking you out to the executive order, a CSMS, a Federal Register notice, whatever it is.
Mhm. Yeah, great point.
one of the other things that we talked about when we were planning for this call, this webinar, was FTZs and bonded warehouses. So there are notes um, in the executive orders about the fact that if goods that are subject to these tariffs are admitted into a foreign trade zone, then they would have to be admitted in privileged foreign status. And what that means is that when you take the product out of the zone, or when you take something that was manufactured in the zone that contains a component that was admitted into the zone and subject to the new tariffs, you're going to have to pay the tariffs on the resulting product that's pulled out of the zone, that's taken out of the zone, assuming it's not exported. But that doesn't mean that an FTZ is still not a decent strategy to consider when you're looking at ways to mitigate the tariffs. But not only that, but also bonded warehouses might be a strategy that companies should consider. And think of, for example, using either the bonded warehouse or the FTZ as a way to postpone the payment of duties. So cash
Mhm.
flow could be an issue. So if you can put something into a bonded warehouse, you don't have to pay the duty until you take it out of the bonded warehouse. And if you happen to sell it foreign and decide that you're going to export it and never admit it into the US, you may not be eligible for drawback, but you may not have to pay the duty because the goods may have been exported either from the zone or from the bonded warehouse.
Yeah, but Tom, on that point, so this is something that we are also exploring right now as a company. Remember, there's a lot of elements that you have to look at to be able to say that that FTZ, foreign status is reached, and that you're clearly aware and can substantiate what is then flowing back out to an OU, like an outside of the US location. Um, One of the things that you said also triggered my attention in terms of free cash flow. So just a reminder, and maybe something for you to also consider, is for importers, if you're not on ACH, maybe this is the time to be thinking about this, because this is a huge burden on certain brokers, and depending upon what brokers you're utilizing, they may just be flat out demanding that you get ACH as opposed to broker outlay and then, reimbursement. So just something to call out. And then also, bonds and making sure that we've got sufficient bonds. Cindy, did you have comments on that? I feel like you were going to also mention something on bonds, right? Maybe.
Yes, it's
Okay.
something so basic yet something so important. I had a client call me one Saturday afternoon, and he basically was in a frenzy because his bond had reached its limit and he was no longer able to bring goods through the border. And this was a major company. And so when you look at these tariffs, you have to consider that you may need a higher bond limit of liability. But when you think of that, you don't want to just raise it incrementally, like, okay, I have a basic $50,000 bond. I'm now going to go up to 100. When if you do the math that Heidi was talking about at the very beginning of with ACE data, and you know that your bond limit liability is going to be a minimum of 2 million, you're not going to go from 50 to 100 to 200 and so on, because that actually adds to your liability. It's called stacking liability. We don't have enough time to go over that, but definitely learn about stacking liability. I think also that companies don't realize that your surety may also require collateral. If your bond is getting, they might require financial statements to look at your financial statements to make sure the company is solvent enough to be able to grant a bond at that limit of liability. They may require collateral. Your, I tell people right now, your surety is your friend, your broker is your friend, your freight forwarder, your consultant, your attorneys. Make sure you have all the partners you need, because we're in a trade war right now. And if you were in any other kind of war, you would be making sure that you have the people you want to go to war with right by your side. You would be hoarding toilet paper, you would be doing something like that. So make sure you have all the tools you need. You have the ACE data, you're checking out your bond, you have access to, other data that gives you um, the ability to be nimble with respect to your procurement options. Um, so I think that's really important. But bonds, I think, go unrecognized in their importance.
Yes.
Absolutely. Bonds do tie up cash flow if you have, especially if you have to post collateral.
Yeah.
And that's one of the areas that companies get in trouble because of. Absolutely.
And it happens to big companies. So don't
It
think you
does.
work for a big company and it's not going to happen to you. It can happen to you.
Yeah. And that's absolutely right. Um, One of the things that we've talked about a whole bunch of different strategies, a whole bunch of different things that companies can and should be doing in today's environment. When you start implementing some of these strategies and you've started to see some savings and started to see some benefits from the savings, Cindy, I'm going to point to you as an auditor. What do you recommend companies do to make sure that what they did it right, and that they're not going to get in trouble down the road?
That's a great question. I always tell people, when you think of me, think of audit. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. My children certainly think of me and think of audit. I will tell people, try to systemize and create robust internal controls. And what do I mean? Don't do things manually. Do things as systemically as you can. Build procedures, build controls, have systems on the front end. And then on the back end, make sure you're conducting audits, because you can sit there and put the best laid plan together and the best written procedures together, but there might be a weak link along your chain and there's non-compliance. And you're not going to know that unless you're checking. I could tell my teenager, I only have one left now, to go clean his room. He's male. He's not going to clean his room. I got to go audit and see that he cleaned his room. You don't you have to make sure that your internal controls are working as effectively. It's just like a classification database. You go in, you update your classifications, you make sure they're right. Well, there's always that one broker, and I'm not going to blame it on the broker. I'm always going to blame it on the importer. Poor brokers get a bad rap enough, right?
Yep.
There's one broker that isn't using the correct tariff classifications. Why? You forgot to give them the list. You only gave the most updated list to your main broker, but you forgot that you actually use 5 brokers, and maybe you didn't give all your smaller brokers. So there was a breakdown in your system of internal control because you forgot to give that list to your new broker. So just make sure as much as you can systemize things, create robust controls, automate things, use software where appropriate, and good software. Not all software is created equal. And audit, and don't be discouraged. If you have bad audit results, that's okay. You're not going to throw the kid in the garbage because he didn't clean his room. You're going to adjust. You're going to make an adjustment to that internal control. You're going to strengthen it, and then you're going to re-audit until you get a positive audit result and know that your internal control is working as designed, efficiently, effectively, ensuring compliant transactions. Whew, I'm off my soapbox, Tom.
Way to go, Cindy. That was amazing. And is your son now automatically cleaning his room? I just
He
have to
cleans
ask.
his room, he does his laundry,
Okay.
he takes out the trash, he does
What?
dishes. He's ready for
Oh
a
my
girlfriend.
gosh. This is an advertisement for Cindy De Leon, people. I love it. I love it.
Here's another question that came in through the Q&A. Some of the aluminum and steel components may be provided by second and third tier suppliers. Is the expectation that those suppliers would provide mill certificates or cost of the steel and aluminum used in that part? And I'll add to the question, if they don't, what do you do? Either one of you, do either of
Oh
you have a
gosh.
thought?
I don't know. I will say I do not know. I would have to look this up. Cindy,
I,
do you know?
Go ahead, Tom.
I was going to say that I think this question really raises a good point, and that is that in today's environment, it's really important for companies to build relationships with their vendors, with their suppliers to their vendors, with everyone in their supply chain, whether it's a forced labor issue or a tariff issue.
Yeah.
We need more information today to import and to be a prudent business than we did 5, 10 years ago. And it's a time for all of us to sit down and have open and honest conversations with your suppliers, with your customers, with your business partners, because there's a lot of things that are changing. And as an example, to specifically address this question, let's say that you have a business that relies on a lot of steel or aluminum inputs, and the products that you import are on the derivative lists. You need to have a sit down conversation with your vendors and let them know what it's going to mean to them if they don't provide the information. Maybe that means that you're going to go buy their products from somebody that's willing to provide the information that you need. Maybe you need to have a discussion about who's going to cover the cost of this, right? And do you need to maybe go back and review your agreements? Do you need to bring your legal teams in? I would say that in today's environment, absolutely. What do you do with a company that's importing a product that has some steel or aluminum in it and is all of a sudden subject to 25% extra duty, but the profit margin on that product is only 10%? And now you're in a position where it's going to cost you as an importer to import that product. But you have a contract with your supplier that says you're going to buy the product for them at a price, and you're going to buy a certain quantity over a period of time, and you're going to be subject to penalties if you don't. Now is the time to have a sit down conversation and review those agreements. If there are clauses like that, what can you do to build in clauses that allow you to get out of situations where you might not be able to make a profit because of the tariffs? And maybe you're going to have a conversation where you'll split things. Maybe you'll just back out of the agreement. Who knows? Those are the types of conversations you need to have.
Yeah.
Talking about other business partners, let's think about like your freight forwarders. Let's say that you've decided now that you're going to move all your production out of China and you're going to move it to South and Central America. Is your current freight forwarder able to coordinate shipments from Ecuador or from Costa Rica today? And do they have the same relationships that they have with carriers in China? Those types of conversations need to be had today, because if you don't, you're going to be getting into a lot of issues down the road when the issues actually happen.
The only other thing I want to add, Tom, if I can really quickly to the question about tier 2 and tier 3 steel components on the melt and pour requirements on the derivatives and all that is that you have to have intelligence software. Like you just, it's not, if you're in that industry, you can sit down and you can have the conversations with your tier one supplier. But I will tell you firsthand, having been a former government officer, auditor, you can get lied to. I'm just going to be real honest with you. So if there are bad actors in your supply chain, they're going to easily lie to you to conceal the origin because they know the ramifications. And so being able to have data that can show you who's buying from whom um, is critical, is critical. So I'm not saying that everybody needs to jump and get that, but for those of you who are very high risk for these 232 duties, and for those of you that are very high risk for UFLPA, it's not a nice to have anymore. You really need to be able to have this data to be able to do the due diligence. Because I worked one UFLPA, and I know this is not a UFLPA case seminar webinar, but I worked one case where CBP could see using these same software tools, and they were skeptical of the answers given because they were able to see the trade data. They were able to see who the tier 2 and tier 3 vendors were. So just know that CBP has access to a lot of that software as well. They've made that public.
Thank you, Cindy. Heidi, any last minute thoughts?
Gosh, no, I think there's a plethora of expertise, I think, within the organization of AAEI that you can tap into with these things. Go to these webinars. This was incredibly helpful for me, even as a speaker. So I think make sure that you're pulling in what resources you can, and know that you're not alone. We're in this together and we're figuring this out together. So leverage your network and make sure that you're taking care of yourself in this crazy time too.
Thank you. Before we close, please note that you'll see a brief survey at the conclusion of the webinar, and we encourage you to respond. The program was recorded and will be available for viewing in a few days. If you're a member of AAEI, you may access this and all past virtual programming in the Member Center. This webinar has been approved for credit. The verification code for obtaining credit for participating in this event will be shared via email shortly following the event. AAEI will host the next installment of its AI Tools for Trade Compliance series next week, focusing on document digitization and translation. Regulatory scrutiny is increasing, and companies without proper documentation risk costly delays, penalties, and supply chain disruptions. Join this session to hear from experts on how you can leverage technology to help ensure your company is ready and protected. AAEI is also pleased to announce that it is hosting a hybrid Trade Matters fly-in on March 26th. This is a great opportunity to hear from government agencies and officials, as well as trade experts on the latest in imports and exports. In-person attendees will then go to the Hill to further advocate and end the day with a reception hosted by the offices of Kelly Dry. Can't make it in person? Our 8 to 12 programming will be live and made available to virtual attendees, so please plan to join us. Visit the link on the slide to learn more, to see the full agenda and speakers that have been confirmed for the program. AAEI would like to thank Gaia Dynamics for making this programming like this possible and available to our members and the trade community at large. Thank you to our panelists and to you all for joining. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Heidi. Thank you all at AAEI.